This is Dr. Kraus, and this is a video lecture on the Synoptic Gospels for the class BIB 1225 History and Literature of the Early Christians, Nebraska Christian College.
First, I want to begin by talking just about this term, Synoptic Gospels. When a close look is taken at the four Gospels, it soon becomes apparent that the first three of them are very much alike, while the fourth is very different. So because of this, the first three Gospels, meaning Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are usually called the Synoptic Gospels. Now, this term synoptic is a Greek term come into English that literally means seen together. So the idea is you could take these first three Gospels and put them in parallel columns, and you would see a lot of overlap in material. The material in Mark, a lot of it's found in Matthew and in Luke, whereas the material in John is very much not paralleled in these other Gospels. We'll wait and talk about that when we get to John. But because of that, we have these three that are called the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And sometimes we just call them the Synoptics. But when we look at this, there are really a couple of issues that are worth trying to understand. And we lump this under a big heading called the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem is trying to account for the similarities and for the differences in materials, in other words, the stories that they choose to tell, in vocabulary, when they're telling the same story, why do they sometimes use the same words? Why do they sometimes use different words? In order, meaning why do certain ones of the synoptics have one story earlier in a book and another one might have the same story but place it in a different place in the book? And in style, just in general style of the way that they present the material. What can we come up with as a solution for this? It's worth looking at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, and we have the first four verses of Luke are sometimes referred to as the prologue, and he tells in this kind of his plan for presentation. And let me just read this, Luke 1 through 4. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you might know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Now we'll say a little bit more about this when we get to the Gospel of Luke, but I want to point out a couple of things here. First, many have undertaken to draw up an account. So this is the things of the life of Jesus. And when we see this language, draw up an account, we assume these are written accounts. So there are people before Luke writes who have already written down some level of account about Jesus, meaning that he is using sources. Now, as we'll see in a few minutes, I really think one of those sources that he uses is the Gospel of Mark, which has already been written before he starts. Another thing to notice here, though, he says, with this in mind, since I have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you. So Luke is a very careful author. If he doesn't know something, he doesn't make up details. He leaves it blank. And we'll see this when we get to the Gospel of Luke and to the book of Acts. So we can really trust him. But he says he's going to write an orderly account. We don't know exactly what he means by that. Some people take this as being chronologically orderly, meaning he's putting things in a time frame that they happen, chronological order. But maybe not. Maybe he just means that he wants to organize his material so that it flows well, so that it is clean and easy to understand. Um, but significant that Luke would make these kinds of comments about his project of writing. So, what sources might he have used, or for that matter, might any of them have used? Well, we can imagine that they used eyewitness accounts. Luke says as much, and there's evidence in his book, I think, that he did talk to eyewitnesses, or at least maybe one step away, people that had known eyewitnesses and their stories that they learned from them. I think there's evidence in the Gospel of Luke that he had an eyewitness interview with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and also probably with Peter. And I think they use other written accounts. This is what Luke indicates. There's nothing wrong with this, that they would see what other people had written before they start. And we don't have much of that sort of material. We don't, Luke kind of indicates there's a lot of these out there, but not very many of them have survived. And the other gospels that you read about, the secret hidden gospels that they do TV shows on, these are all much later. They're written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So these are not the things that Luke is writing and using. But there were other written accounts. We'll see how that plays out in a minute. They use the Old Testament. This is particularly true of Matthew, to a lesser extent Luke himself, but also Mark uses the Old Testament, as does John. So all of them see the Old Testament as a source for their material. The prophecies about Jesus are worth including, and so they quote the Old Testament frequently. And then finally, we don't want to underestimate the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. I don't understand totally how that works. I don't think they're hearing a voice in their head from the Holy Spirit that tells them exactly what to write. But there's a guiding, inspired guiding of these authors. We really believe that as Christians, that God is involved in the writing of these books. Now, I usually say inspiration means partly that what they do, what they write is true and it's accurate. And also I would say the Holy Spirit helps them not write too much. They don't write things that are not necessary, but not too little. They don't leave out details that God in His providence thinks are important for the composition of these books. So how do we solve this synoptic problem? Well, a couple of things from the ancient world. There was a Syrian, and by Syria we mean Damascus or Antioch, and this guy's operating in that general area. His name was Tatian, and he was a church official, and he took it upon himself to take the 4 Gospels and combine them into one account, and he calls this the Diatessaron. The Diatessaron, he's doing this about AD 170, so toward the end of the 2nd century. So this is about 100 years after all the Gospels have been completed, the 4 Gospels that we use. He uses them, and he also seems to have some other material that he plugs in. We don't know how much, because the problem with the Diatessaron is that there are no surviving copies. If someone were to find in a manuscript hoard somewhere an actual ancient copy of the Diatessaron, it would be the greatest find in New Testament studies for the last 200 or 300 years. And scholars would love to get their hands on that. But all we have are little fragments or quotes of the Diatessaron in other authors, people who, when they were writing, had a copy. The thing that happens with the Diatessaron, and let me say a word first about the name. Diatessaron is actually like a musical term, and it means chord of a fourth or 4-part chord. So a 4-note chord. It's one musical sound with 4 parts. That's what he intended his work to be like. And the Syrian church used the Diatessaron for a long time, and then they gained some leaders who did not like that and thought that it was better that they would use each of the 4 Gospels. So literally they kind of placed a ban on the Diatessaron, and because of this and some other reasons, Tatian was declared later a heretic, and his writings were forbidden, and all the copies of the Diatessaron were burned that they could find. which apparently was most of the copies because we don't have one. Um, I would say a little bit in that at some schools they teach a class called Life of Christ, which is really the same approach as Tatian had in the Diatessaron, which the church judged to be not adequate and unsuccessful. We have chosen here at Nebraska Christian College to teach the four Gospels as they stand. So we have Gospels 1 and Gospels 2. Gospels 1 is Matthew and Mark, and we study each book on its own. It's not that we don't pay attention to the other ones at all, but we want to hear what Matthew has to say. We want to hear his story. We want to hear what Mark has to say, and then second semester we do Luke and John. The first person that we know about that really recognizes this synoptic problem, though, and talks about it is St. Augustine, and we date him about AD 400. He has several things to say about this, but Augustine notices that John is very different, and these first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very similar. And he sees the books as dependent upon each other, and he finally decides that Matthew was the original Gospel. Matthew wrote first. Mark wrote second. He had a copy of Matthew, and basically all he did was he condensed it. He made it shorter. And that Luke then writes third, and he has Matthew and Mark both to use as sources. So we would refer to this as the theory of Matthean priority. Matthew is the first written, Matthean priority. And that was the understood solution to the synoptic problem for many hundreds of years until the 19th century. But beginning in the 19th century, scholars were not quite satisfied with Augustine's solution, and so they begin to look at this in other ways. And I want to just give you some statistics here. If we outline the number of verses in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, you can see here Mark 661 verses, Matthew 1068 verses, and Luke 1149 verses, Luke the longest. And by the way, some translations use different verse setups, and so you may find different numbers if you do this yourself, depending on the translation you use. Out of these, in Mark, out of his 661 verses, how many of them are found in some way in Matthew? Well, by my judgment, a little over 600. And at the same way, about 380 of Mark's 661 are found in the Gospel of Luke, so a little bit over half. In fact, there are only about 31 verses in the Gospel of Mark that are unique, not found in Luke or Matthew, or certainly not in John. And when we get to Mark, we'll talk about that a little bit more detail. So you see how this works for the other ones. I won't go through all of this, but the most interesting thing here is this little factoid, and that is how many verses in Luke are paralleled in Matthew but are not in Mark. So this is material that Luke and Matthew share, but it's material that doesn't have anything to do with the material in Mark. Unique material, not in Mark, but about 250 verses, about a quarter of the verses in Matthew and about 20% of the verses in Luke are found in both of them. And when scholars looked at this, they listed all of these 250 verses. One of the things they noticed was that they were mainly sayings of Jesus. In other words, they weren't the actions of Jesus. It wasn't Jesus doing miracles or anything like that. They were the sayings of Jesus, and a pretty significant bunch of stuff. So this is the solution that we usually understand today, and that is that Mark wrote first using his best material, And as we'll see in a few days, that Mark is dependent upon Peter as probably his primary source, the preaching of. There was another document or maybe several documents out there that were just the collected sayings of Jesus. In other words, if Jesus was seen as a great teacher, there were some people who weren't as concerned about telling the story of his life, but they wanted to preserve his sayings. And so scholars have come up with this is really a hypothetical source, hypothetical document. We don't have a copy of this. We don't know for sure if it existed. And it's called the Q document. And students get a big kick out of that. Well, the Q document, is that because it was from Q Street in Omaha? No, it's because the Greek word, or I'm sorry, the Germans who did this, their word quelle, which starts with a Q, quelle, means source. So it means the source document. They're not really trying to do anything. So under this theory, Mark writes, and he doesn't have access to this saying source, or if he does, he doesn't use it. But Matthew writes second. He uses Mark's basic outline, and he plugs in material from this saying source where it's appropriate. And then he's got some of his own material too. If he were a disciple, he had some eyewitness material. Luke writes third, and he also uses Mark, and he also uses Q, the saying source, but he doesn't have access to Matthew. He's not reading Matthew and using his material. Luke also has his own unique material, and when we get to Luke, we'll see a lot of that. You know, his stories of parable of the Good Samaritan, for example, only found in Luke. Parable of the prodigal son, only found in Luke. Parable of the rich man and Lazarus, only found in Luke. So he has access to some special material that Mark doesn't use or doesn't have, that Matthew doesn't use or doesn't have, and Luke plugs this material in also. So this is seen as kind of the two-source solution to the synoptic problem, that both Matthew and Luke use Mark and Q. We don't have Q anymore. We'd love to get that too. If somebody found a copy of a document that was just sayings of Jesus that looked authentic from the first century, I don't know what they would call it. They wouldn't call it Q. It's just, you know, the tag that scholars use for this idea. Stuff important. Well, it's because in the end, we end up with the theory of Mark-on priority, that Mark wrote first. And I think this is significant because it will influence the way that we understand the Gospels. For many, many years, Mark was seen as the least important of the Gospels and basically neglected and wasn't preached out of. People didn't write commentaries on it. Matthew and Luke or John were the beefy Gospels that had a lot of good material. So they were the ones that were preached. Mark was neglected. That's really changed in the last 100 years or so. So now there are a lot of good commentaries written on Mark and a lot of understandings based on this Mark-on priority theory. So we would say this. Mark wrote first. I would date Mark AD 65 or 66. Before the destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew wrote second. He used Mark, basically used Mark as his outline for the book, and he expands the Gospel of Mark by using his own style, his own vocabulary. He, by the way, plugs in a lot of Old Testament stuff. He has some of his own material. For example, the story of the wise men, and in Matthew chapter 2, the story of Joseph and how he related to Mary, almost divorced her, but was told by an angel to marry her instead. In Matthew chapter 1, those are unique things found only in Matthew. He has that material. He includes it. He also includes some of the sayings of Jesus that we find perhaps in this Q document that we don't have. We wish we did have it. And then Luke writes third. He uses Mark. He also has his unique material. All of his narrative stories about Jesus' birth, the nativity stories, the trip to Bethlehem, all that stuff is unique to Luke. So he's got a lot of unique material. He also uses this Q document and plugs in some sayings of Jesus that have been preserved by other people. And he writes third, and probably Matthew is writing soon after the destruction of Jerusalem, maybe in the early 70s. I would date Luke in the late 70s, maybe early 80s, not much later than that. John writes fourth then. He's the last to write. I think there's some evidence that John has access to all of these three Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Doesn't really care that much. He's not going to try to use them very much because he wants to tell his own story. And in many ways, he seems to avoid duplicating the things that they've told. Let me just give you one example of this. That Mark, Matthew, and Luke are all very concerned to tell the story of the Last Supper, where Jesus institutes what we call the Lord's Supper. And we celebrate the Lord's Supper on a weekly basis in many churches today based on what happened that night, the night he was betrayed. Well, John tells the story of the Last Supper, but not of the institution of the Lord's Supper. He doesn't tell that story at all. Now, there's some allusions to that in chapter 6, where John talks in the Bread of Life discourse of Jesus saying, "You must eat my flesh and drink my blood, and you'll live forever," which is an obvious allusion to the Lord's Supper. But John doesn't want to duplicate, or doesn't feel a need to duplicate, most of what the synoptics have written, and seems to be very aware of what he's doing.